Howdy. Welcome back to Bloodleaf. We're on chapter 4 in this video, page 33. When I got back to my room following my time in worship, my maid, Emily, was already there, sweeping up what looked like bits of broken glass. She had a round, rosy face and was probably a year or two younger than me, though she was just as tall. She'd been working for me for several weeks now, which was quite a long while, considering that I went through waiting maids like the dancing princesses of my childhood storybooks went through shoes. They rarely lasted more than a day. Occasionally I'd come across my former maids elsewhere on the grounds, mucking out horse stalls or emptying chamber pots or removing entrails from chickens in the kitchen yard. I'd march past them, head always high, until I was out of sight. Sometimes I'd cry, knowing they preferred chamber pots and entrails to me, but only if no one was around to see. "Begging your pardon, milady," she said, hurrying to finish sweeping glass bits off the floor. "I'd hoped to have this done before you returned." "Let me see," I said. Reluctantly, she held out her dustpan. Among the pieces of glass was a large rock painted with ward symbols. It bore a single word, Malefica. An old word, most often interpreted nowadays to mean witch. I'd seen it a couple of times in the torn remnants of spellbook pages or scribbled in archaic notes in the margins. In all those sparse mentions, however, it never felt like a description. It always seemed more like a name. Apparently, someone thought the moniker suited me. "I've already arranged to have the window replaced, milady," Emily said. "I'd hoped to at least have this cleaned up before you got back in, so I wouldn't have to see it." I frowned. "Have there been other things you fixed up before I got to see them?" She looked at me shyly from under her lashes. "There have been?" "I didn't want to frighten you, milady. Just the work of pranksters and superstitious villagers. Nothing to be worried about, I'm sure." Emily scurried to put the stone and shattered pieces of glass out of sight while I situated myself by the broken pane. My private inner room had a good view of the barracks and the stables, so I spotted Kellen easily. He was leading Falada, an exquisite white mare, across the yard to the round pen. I observed them wistfully. The Graythorn family and their horses were renowned, and Falada was a rare Empyrean, perfectly tempered and trained. Kellen had raised her himself from the time she was a foal. Watching them together, I found it easy to believe that the divine Imperia would have taken such a form when she came to earth, as we'd been taught. There could be no nobler, more beautiful creature in existence. I should have been glad that Kellen had a moment to get out and ride her before returning to duty for the banquet that evening, but I was jealous instead. As if sensing the brush of my thoughts against him, Kellen turned his head up to my open window, and seeing me, he gave a salute. Then he mounted Falada and reined her away. "What would you like to wear to the banquet, milady?" Emily opened the wardrobe wide to let me inspect my options. "You choose," I told her, as I always told my waiting maids. The girl surveyed the dresses with enthusiasm, sweeping a gown of green satin from its hook after less than a minute of looking. I was surprised, seeing her holding it out for my approval, that it wasn't black. The other waiting maids never chose anything but black. "You don't like it?" No, I do. Just, what made you pick that one?" "Emerald was my mother's favorite stone," she said, lifting my day dress over my head before helping me step into the gown. "She had an emerald ring that looked just this same color of green. She always told me it's a stone of wisdom and foresight." "Does your mother know very much about stones?" The girl was threading the laces of the bodice. "She did, yes, milady, before she died. She liked those twisty knot braids, too. She taught me a few fancy ones." She lifted a section of my hair. "I think it would look nice. Would you like me to try?" I shrugged. "Why not?" "Your mother, she must have been young. Was it the fever epidemic last winter?" "Not fever, no. She was burned for a witch 4 years ago." I felt the coil at my center tighten. Emily couldn't be more than 15 or 16, which meant she was only 11 or 12 at the time of the execution. Motherless and alone at the bewildering brink between girlhood and womanhood. I couldn't imagine what it must have been like for her. And Emily's mother was just another of the countless number of men and women killed for the practice of witchcraft. Innocent or guilty of the charges, it didn't matter. I raged at the unfairness, the vicious pointlessness of the loss. "I'm sorry," I murmured, my voice tinny. I didn't know what else to say. "As am I." She stepped away to give me a look over. "She was a good person," she said, quieter. "What they call witches, most of them are just regular people, nice people. The evil ones are those that hunt and hurt others, witch or no." I snagged her hand and held it. "Thank you," I said. It was a brave thing to say aloud, even to someone like me. There's a little star here indicating a break, so I'm going to have some coffee. Delightful. Most days I took my meals alone in my rooms, not because I had any particular aversion to eating with my brother and mother and the rest of the court, but because of the dead man at the bottom of the staircase that led to the banquet hall. The stairs were steep, and his fall down them must have been terrible, because his neck was bent at such a deeply unsettling angle. Shh! Shades like him were often pinned in place by the memory of their traumatic death, burdened with a compulsive need to share it, even re-experience it, and if he touched me, I'd be forced to watch it happen again. Often the spirit's memories were so vivid that I could not distinguish them from reality. I relived them as if they were happening to me in real time, and right now I could not afford to collapse, blind and screaming, in such a public place. I'd be dragged away to the gallows before I ever hit the floor. On days like this, I was forced to pass the ghost on the stairs or use the only other route to the banquet hall. As I took my first step inside the kitchen doors and the buzzing energy of the staff stuttered to a halt, I wondered if I might have been better off risking the stairs. I lifted my chin and made my way past the plates of steaming meat pies and platters of roasted duck that were waiting for their florid entrance. I didn't flinch, even as the servants stared. They could think me strange, but I'd never let them think I was apologetic about it. When I came into the hall, the dinner guests were all steeped in conversation, and so did not seem to notice my entrance from the service door. Kellen was nearby, though, waiting without comment. He never asked me about my peculiar habits anymore. He'd decided long ago that I was the product of my circumstances, that if it weren't for my betrothal to the Prince of Aklava, no one would have thought twice about my strange habits and weird eyes, and I'd have never developed these evasive routines. If I told him about the broken-necked man on the banquet hall stairs, or the purple-faced girl beneath the surface of the lily pond, or the bleak-eyed woman who paced the west wing parapet, he'd probably think me mad. Kellen guided me to my place at the head table. He looked polished and powerful in his gold and ivory uniform and cobalt-colored cloak, the ceremonial costume of the ranking guard. I chewed on the inside of my cheek and made an effort not to notice how one of his corkscrew curls had escaped the rest and was now dangling fetchingly against his brow. "You're not wearing black," he observed. "I didn't know you owned dresses of other colors." "I don't always wear black." "I suppose you're right. I think I saw you in gray once." I wasn't sure if I should smile or glower at him, but I didn't have to choose. He took his place behind my chair, back to being a guard now that we were in full view of the waiting guests. Formality was something he could take on and off like a mask. One moment he was the heart-strong boy who'd laughingly taught me to ride when I was 14 and friendless. The next he was the stern and practical knight, in whom I could entrust my safety but never my secrets. I loved the first one, in a discreet and delicate way, known only to myself, but I was thankful for the second. Seeing him so distant, so rigidly severe, made it feel like maybe I wouldn't be losing as much. "All rise for Queen Genevieve and Prince Conrad." A ripple went across the room as everyone scrambled from their chairs to pay respect to the entering queen and crown prince. Conrad had his arm linked with Mother's, leading her with a dignified tip of his chin, though he was only half her height. He'd never enjoyed the spotlight, preferring books to banquets and arithmetic problems to people, but his posture was proper and steady. He'd been practicing. I could tell. He was even smiling a little. Now, only months away from his 7th birthday, he looked like a small copy of our father, with his golden hair and blue, blue eyes. At least, he did until he saw me, and his smile wavered and disappeared. He gave me a polite nod. We used to have a game in which I'd tie a colored ribbon someplace he would see it, on a door handle or the branch of a tree or a staircase spindle, which meant that somewhere nearby I'd hidden a prize or a treat. The color of the ribbon told him where to look: yellow for up, blue for down, red for north, green for south, purple for east, orange for west. Black meant it was within 10 paces and hidden from view. White meant it was within 20 paces and in plain sight. When he found his prize, he'd hide one for me using the same rules. It was an excuse for me to spoil him, really. I showered him with candies and riddle books and little toys I had to sneak out to the marketplace to purchase. When his hands were busy, he found it easier to focus during lessons and lengthy state functions. So I got him puzzle boxes, tiny gyro spinners, a ring that concealed a small compass, and, my favorite, a walnut-sized figurine made of metal and magnets, with parts that could be twisted and rearranged into the shape of a half-dozen different animals. It was our own secret pastime, and I reveled in it while it lasted. But it was inevitable that Conrad would eventually cross paths with the whispers about me. It was clear that somewhere in the last months he had heard the rumors, understood them, and begun to believe them. He didn't trust me anymore, and I knew it was only a matter of time before that distrust soured into something worse. I could hardly bear it, and so I coped the only way I knew how. I avoided him. After my mother and brother were seated, the rest of us followed, and soon servants were scurrying around, filling goblets and lighting candles. The seat to my left was unoccupied. It was my father's chair, and would remain empty until Conrad ascended the throne. The seat to my right was where the toothless, doddering Marchioness of Hallett usually sat, too senile to speak to me or complain about me. But the Marchioness was not in attendance. Her seat was instead occupied by a man in an austere black tribunal coat. "You look lovely, Princess," Taurus said. "That color suits you." "Thank you, Taurus," I said through a tight smile. He absently straightened the place setting, his rings, of which there were 5 on each hand, 1 for each finger, glinting. Mother said he'd been an academic once, a man with an unquenchable curiosity for history, who'd traveled far and wide collecting myths and artifacts, who had won her cousin Camilla's love with his humor and wit. Losing his wife changed him, Mother said. But I remembered Camilla well. She was sweet and kind and lovely as a summer's day. The Taurus of my memory was exactly as detestable as the one currently straightening the silverware into precise and even parallels. If ever there had been a different version of this man, it was gone before I was old enough to recall it, long before Camilla died. When the seafood fork was exactly 1 inch from the soup spoon, he said offhandedly, "I saw you this morning, dear princess, somewhere you shouldn't have been." He leaned forward on his arms and turned to stare at me. "You're getting rather reckless, don't you think? You do well to be more careful." I already heard this lecture from my mother. "You should listen to her. A great woman, your mother." I felt my lip curl. In the 8 months between Camilla's and my father's deaths and my brother's birth, Taurus insinuated himself into my mother's circle. Weren't they both grieving spouses? But everyone knew there was more to it than that, because Renault's crown could only be passed to a male inheritor. Our position would have become instantly precarious if the baby was a girl. To remain in power, Mother would be forced to marry, and marry quickly. Taurus was the logical choice. Everyone said so. I was thankful every day that Conrad turned out to be a boy. With a son to inherit, there was no need for Mother to marry. Indeed, doing so might weaken Conrad's royal claim. Conrad's birth saved me from a lifetime with Taurus as stepfather. Or king. I didn't know which one would have been worse. Taurus was looking at me with his most concerned paternal expression. Because of my position inside the tribunal, I have been able, at your mother's behest, to steer them away from you on more than one occasion. Now that these last two cases, Mabel Doyle and the other, Harriet, I think it was, have been resolved, I've little doubt I'll have to concert my efforts on your behalf once more. Hilda, I murmured. Her name was Hilda. Why would you remember her name? He looked down his narrow nose at me. That is exactly the kind of thing that makes people wary of you. Your sympathies are suspect. Be warned, it's only a matter of time before I run out of Hildas to distract them with. A smile crept across his face. He'd convicted a woman who was almost certainly innocent, and he wanted me to be thankful that he'd done it, and would do it again. I gripped the stem of my goblet so tight my fingernails bit into my skin. Hilda would haunt her daughter-in-law, but I shared the blame in her death. Lisette arrived today and should be along shortly, Taurus said, cheerily changing the subject. Quietly, so Kellen couldn't hear. He said, She has been very anxious to see Lieutenant Graythorne again. She has a particular fondness for him, I'm told. It was a special talent he had, to send a needle straight into my heart through the tiniest flaw in my armor. It wasn't that Lisette cared for Kellen that way. I sincerely doubted she did. But that Taurus knew I did. I took a breath. Well, I now knew a few of the chinks in his armor, too. I thought that maybe, now that you're letting Aklavin ships into your port, she might set her sights on a nice burly Aklavin sailor. You'd make a fine grandfather to a whole brood of sturdy Aklavin pups. Aren't you a wonder? He asked, eyes narrowing into half-moons while the smile remained frozen on his face. Not afraid of anything, are you? I'm afraid of marrying the sickly Prince of Aklava. I'm afraid of never seeing my mother or brother again. I'm afraid of the tribunal. I'm afraid that Kellen protects me only out of duty. I'm afraid of the ghosts that lie around every corner. I'm afraid that someday soon I'll be joining them in the hereafter. I took another drink. Not anything. He brushed his suit coat and leaned back. You should be. The wolves howl, Aurelia, and there may come a time when I will no longer be able to hold them back. An oily little smile played on his lips, making it clear that he was looking forward to it. And that's the end of Chapter 4. We'll see you next time for Chapter 5.